Hey there. This is John Hiltz with Janesville Christian Church, and I want to share with you our Bible study from last night. We are entering a new letter. We're going through the letters of Paul, and we have already done First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, and Second Corinthians is actually available to you on a playlist here on YouTube. And so you can go ahead and watch those if you want. I'll start a new playlist for Galatians. So today we find ourselves in Galatians in our introduction to it. So I'm going to kind of give an overview of the author and background stuff and time and place of writing and the whole purpose of the letter, and then a brief outline. And that'll be it for this study. And then next week we'll be back online and start looking at Galatians chapter 1. So the author of this letter to the Galatian church is Paul. We see that in chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 5, verse 2, where Paul names himself, I, Paul. So he is the author of this book. One thing I did find interesting is that even though the unanimous decision is that he wrote this letter to the early church, even modern critics who challenge the authorship of many of the New Testament books concede that Galatians is truly Pauline. So some people actually were trying to say that he was not the author, but it was definitely Paul. Paul wrote this letter. So as far as background goes, during his first missionary journey, Paul, together with Barnabas, had the opportunity to establish several churches in the Roman province of Galatia. On his second trip, Paul and Silas visited them again as well. And so he established this church in his first missionary journey. And it wasn't long, however, before some Jewish Christians came in and began teaching that Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised to keep the law of Moses, similar to what happened to the church in Antioch of Syria in Acts 15, verse 1. And so in an effort to persuade the Galatians, it appears the tactic was to discredit Paul as an apostle, challenge his concept of the gospel of Christ, and charge his doctrine with leading to loose living. So we know through previous studies of Corinthians that Paul's apostleship was always under question. And that's because we know who Paul was. Paul was Saul, who was a Jew who persecuted the Christians, tried to destroy the Christian church. And so he's always had to battle that, people doubting his apostleship. And we will see throughout this letter how Paul defends that. And he did the same back in his letters to the Corinthian church. And so we have these Jewish Christians, these people who were once Jews, who were under the Mosaic law, is trying to tell these Gentile Christians who are now one of, quote unquote, them as Christians, that they must be circumcised as they are circumcised, trying to push old laws onto these new Gentile Christians. And we'll learn more about that as we go along in this letter to the Galatian church. As far as time and place, dating Galatians is affected by one's view of whether the churches of Galatia were established or located in the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom. And so the long story short, the general consensus is that this was established in the southern Galatia kingdom, which identifies the churches of Galatia as those established on Paul's first journey, which I said earlier. And then that would have the writing of this letter right around AD 55. Some say late 40, some say early 50. So right around that time is when he wrote this letter. And some say he wrote it in Ephesus, a period that's covered in Acts 19, 1 through 41. On his third missionary journey, he wrote this letter to this church, trying to square away some issues that these Jewish Christians were trying to implement in this church that he established. So the whole purpose of this epistle, this letter, the churches in Galatia were being influenced by those who would pervert the gospel of Christ, known as Judaizing teachers. These individuals taught that Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. Well, that's an interesting concept. You know, we have old covenant and new covenant. And we in the Christian church are under the new covenant. Christ's blood shed for us brought forth the new covenant. The curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the area was torn in two, meaning that we can now approach the Holy of Holies, God, personally through Jesus Christ and his shed blood. Where in the old covenant, you couldn't. You had to go through the priest. So we're now under the new covenant, and new covenant is love. The old covenant is law, and law was binding, law was restricting. And these Judas, these Jewish Christians, were trying to push these laws on these Gentile Christians. You got to understand what these Jewish Christians are going through. I mean, they have been through generations of law and memorizing the Torah and the first 5 books of the Bible, and so they have all these old things ingrained in them. And so I would think in with good intentions, try to get the Gentiles to practice the same. But Jesus came, right, not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? And so he did through his blood on the cross. And so we're not bound to those laws anymore. And Paul recognized that this doctrine would jeopardize the salvation of those souls who accept it, because they'll be bound to the law and be bounded by it. And we're supposed to be free from that. And that was because the enemies of the true gospel were trying to support their case by undermining Paul's authority as an apostle of Christ. It was necessary to verify that he was truly an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. That's what Paul always says. I am not from men through man, but through Christ and God the Father is my authentication of my apostleship. Therefore, Paul writes this letter to verify his apostleship and the gospel of justification by faith in Christ, not by law, but by faith in Christ. And because of his outstanding defense of the gospel of Christ, in which we have freedom from sin and the law, this letter has frequently been called the Magna Carta of the Christian liberty, or the Declaration of Independence of Christian liberty, or our Christian faith. It's kind of like our main document for the church, right? And so the key verse for this letter is Galatians 5:1, that we are to stand fast, therefore, in the liberty or the freedom by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Don't be entangled in that, but instead stand firm on the freedom in which Christ has made us free, and that is through his shed blood on the cross. So this letter is outlined. This introduction is found in 1 through 10, and that is his greeting, his salutation, verses 1 through 5, and then his whole reason for the letter, verses 6 through 10. And then Paul goes to the next section, chapter 1 through chapter 221, which Paul defends his apostleship, right? That he is a genuine apostle. We got to understand, too, that when these letters were written, there was no verses or chapters or sections. It was all just one. But over time, they tried to split things up to make more sense. And so in defending his apostleship, he talks about the origin of his gospel. His gospel received directly from God, and then his pre-Christian years, kind of like his testimony and his conversion. And then he defends his apostleship with his relationship to others apostles, those who he has done ministry with, kind of verifying his apostleship through them. And then our next section is how Paul's defense of the gospel of justification by faith, basically justifying all that he preached, which is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, and it's by faith that we attain that. So he starts with a personal argument. Then he goes on to a scriptural argument, talk about Abraham and the curse of the law and all sort of stuff. The practical argument, which is trying to break it down to more simpler form, and then the sentimental argument, trying to play on their feelings, and then the allegorical argument. So those are your Paul defending the gospel of justification by faith. And then the last section Paul makes a stand, right? A call to stand fast in the liberty, in the freedom of the gospel, a liberty that excludes the necessity of circumcision, right? Because laws are binding, but love is freeing, and that is made right through the cross of Christ. So we're not bound to that necessity of circumcision. Paul speaks of circumcision of the heart, right? Getting away with the old man and bringing in the new man. Then he goes on to talk about the freedom that fulfills the law, right? Jesus said, I come to fulfill, not to change. And then a freedom in which one is to be led by the Spirit. Now the Spirit of God lives in us. When Jesus left, he told the disciples, hold on, I'm going to send something greater than I, and that is a Spirit living within you. And then a freedom with a sense of responsibility. Because with the Christian life comes responsibility, helping those with burdens, doing good to all, thus sowing to the Spirit. And then he concludes with his final rebuke to those who would bind circumcision. And then Paul's confidence in the cross of Christ, and then his benediction. So that's a quick outline and overview. I will put this document at janesvillechristianchurch.org under our Bible study tab. So you can go there and pull this up and look at it. Maybe as you view this video or after the fact is fine. But Paul wrote many letters. His letters take up most of the New Testament. The Pauline epistles, the letters, and he's writing to many churches, and we're going to go through these. After this is Ephesians, uh, Philippians, Colossians, so the letters go on. But it's through these letters, especially the book of Acts, that we get our foundations of Christian faith and the Christian church. There wasn't a lot today, but I will post this video at janesvillechristianchurch.org. And please go on there and get the printout of the outline of Galatians as well. So hope I see you next week as we start with Galatians chapter 1. You folks have a blessed day.